Imagine dedicating your entire life, every waking moment really, and every ounce of your intellect to building an empire.
Right.
And not just some temporary kingdom, but a colossal continent-spanning superpower that you explicitly designed to last for 10,000 generations.
A permanent fixture of reality.
Exactly. You crush your enemies, you rewrite the laws of the physical world, you bend millions of people to your will, and then you die.
As we all do.
As we do. But within a mere 15 years of your death, that monumental 10,000 generation empire completely and spectacularly implodes.
It just vanishes into smoke and ash.
It vanishes. Welcome to the Deep Dive. You are really in for a psychological thriller today. We are looking at a massive stack of sources today.
We've got ancient historical texts, modern archaeological reports, academic analyses from sinologists.
Yeah, and cross-cultural historical debates. All of this is focused on unpacking the life, the mind, and the ultimate unraveling of Qin Shi Huang.
The first emperor of China.
The first emperor. The man who unified a completely fractured land, laid the groundwork for the Great Wall, and commissioned the legendary Terracotta Army.
And our mission today goes way beyond just, a timeline of ancient battles. This isn't textbook reading for you.
No, not at all.
We are exploring the intoxicating nature of absolute power, the paralyzing grip of paranoia, and really the devastating weight of unintended consequences.
Which is the fascinating core of this history, I think. How the exact tools and methods he used to forge a unified nation out of pure chaos
were the very things that guaranteed its spectacular destruction.
Yes. So we are going to separate the verifiable facts from what is essentially a 2,000-year-old smear campaign. To understand the first emperor, we have to drop ourselves into the incredibly volatile world he was born into.
Right, let's set the stage.
The year is 259 BC. The setting is the state of Zhao, specifically the city of Handan. Our protagonist is born with the name Ying Zhang.
Or Zhao Zing, depending on the text.
Right. His father is Prince Yiren of the state of Qin. But Prince Yiren isn't living in a palace in his homeland. He is trapped in Handan as a political hostage.
Yeah, which sounds wild to modern ears.
It really does. Walk us through the mechanics of this hostage system, because it seems wildly counterintuitive to just hand over your own royal family members to your sworn enemies.
It does, but it was actually a cornerstone of diplomacy during the Warring States period.
Okay.
You have 7 major states locked in this perpetual existential struggle for dominance. Treaties were inherently fragile. So, to ensure an armistice, states would exchange members of their royal houses.
Like collateral.
Exactly like collateral. The logic was brutal but very clear. If the state of Qin broke the treaty and attacked Zhao,
the Zhao leadership would immediately execute the Qin prince they held captive.
Precisely. So Prince Yiren was living under constant, suffocating surveillance. Every single day, his life depended entirely on political decisions being made hundreds of miles away.
By a father who, frankly, considered him expendable. He was a middle son, right?
He was. He wasn't the heir apparent. He was highly expendable.
So baby Ying Zhang is born into this environment of supreme life or death anxiety. That alone would completely shape a child's psychology.
Oh, absolutely.
But the circumstances of his birth are where the historical narrative turns into this high-stakes Byzantine court intrigue. Enter a fabulously wealthy merchant from the state of Wei named Lu Bu Wei.
Ah, yes. Lu Bu Wei.
According to the famous Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian, who wrote the records of the Grand Historian, Lu Bu Wei orchestrates a massive conspiracy involving Ying Zhang's parentage.
And Sima Qian's account is the origin of a paternity scandal that shadowed the first emperor for millennia.
Right.
The text claims Lu Bu Wei saw the captive Prince Yiren not as a doomed hostage, but as an undervalued political asset.
An incredible investment opportunity.
Exactly. A venture capitalist looking at a startup. Lu Bu Wei begins bankrolling Yiren. He helps him navigate the deadly politics of Handan and actually starts lobbying for his succession back in Qin.
But the scandalous rumor centers on a dancing girl, a concubine belonging to Lu Bu Wei himself, known as Lady Zhao.
Right.
Sima Qian writes that Prince Yiren attended a banquet at Lu Bu Wei's house, saw Lady Zhao, and fell instantly in love. He essentially begs Lu Bu Wei to marry her.
And Lu Bu Wei, supposedly furious at first, eventually agrees.
But here is the massive historical bombshell Sima Qian drops. Lady Zhao was already pregnant by Lu Bu Wei.
Yes.
And she allegedly gave birth to Ying Zhang after an unusually long pregnancy. So if you take Sima Qian at his word, the great first emperor of China, The man who conquered the known world wasn't a royal at all.
He was the illegitimate son of a merchant.
Which is, I mean, we really have to pause and critically examine why Sima Qin, writing over a century later during the Han Dynasty, would include this specific detail.
We do, because you have to look at the ancient Confucian societal hierarchy to understand the burn here.
Okay, break that down for us.
In this worldview, society was divided into four main classes. At the top were the scholar officials, then the peasant farmers who actually produced the food.
Right, the backbone of society.
Then the artisans who crafted useful goods. And at the absolute bottom were the merchants.
Because merchants didn't produce anything themselves. They just moved goods around and profited off the labor of others.
Precisely. They were viewed as parasitic, greedy, morally suspect. So to suggest that the all-powerful, terrifying first emperor was actually the bastard son of a merchant.
It was the ultimate political insult.
It was a calculated character assassination. It was completely designed to undermine the legitimacy of the entire Qin Dynasty.
And modern sinologists have scrutinized this claim heavily, right?
Oh, very heavily. Scholars like Dirk Bode point out that this detail reads like a classic interpolation.
Meaning a later addition.
Yeah, added specifically to slander the first emperor. John Knobloch and Geoffrey Regal, who translated the annals of Lu Bue, they go even further. They call the story patently false, a fabricated narrative designed to cast aspersions on the emperor's biological and political right to rule.
But imagine the psychological toll that kind of whisper campaign would take on a young ruler. Because whether the rumor was true or not, and the academic consensus strongly suggests it wasn't, those whispers definitely echoed in the halls of power.
Without a doubt.
Growing up with enemies secretly calling you a merchant's bastard would breed a profound, almost violent need to constantly assert your legitimacy.
And your absolute authority over everyone else. That underlying insecurity really becomes a defining trait for him.
So through Lu Bue's intense financial and political machinations, Prince Yarn actually survives the hostage situation. He returns to Qin, and he becomes king.
But he dies after a very short reign of just 3 years.
Right. So in 246 BC, at the tender age of 13, young Yingzheng ascends the throne as the king of Qin.
But because he is a minor, Lu Bue acts as his regent. He essentially wields the absolute power of the state.
A 13-year-old king with an immensely powerful merchant-turned-regent running the show. As Yingzheng transitions from a boy to a young man, he has to realize he is essentially a figurehead.
He does. Lu Bue holds the actual reins.
And just as the young king is coming of age, a deeply embarrassing and honestly dangerous threat emerges from his own mother's inner chambers.
The Queen Dowager Zhao, Yingzheng's mother. She is still young and still politically active, and Lu Bue, who had a prior intimate relationship with her before she married Yuan, realizes the incredible danger he is in.
Because the young king is getting sharper, more independent.
Exactly. If Yingzheng discovers that his regent is carrying on an illicit affair with the Queen Mother, Lu Bue's execution would be immediate.
No trial, just execution.
Just done. So to insulate himself, Lu Bue devises a scheme to distract the Queen Mother. He provides her with a new lover.
But getting a biological man into the queen's inner palace requires circumventing ironclad security protocols.
Yeah.
The only men allowed in those quarters are eunuchs.
Right.
So Lu Bue finds a man named Lao Ai, who is notoriously well endowed, and he fakes his castration. The historical records literally state they disguised him as a eunuch by plucking out his beard and eyebrows.
It sounds almost absurd.
It's completely bonkers, plucking a beard to fool the royal guards. But the political consequences were deadly serious.
And the disguise works perfectly. Lao Ai is smuggled into the inner palace. He quickly becomes the Queen Mother's favorite.
And their relationship becomes so entrenched that they secretly have 2 sons together.
Which is a massive treasonous act. They hide these children away, and Lao Ai begins to amass immense wealth and influence through the Queen Mother's patronage.
He is given the title of Marquis, vast estates, thousands of servants.
His ego inflates to match his new station. He actually begins cultivating his own political faction to rival Lu Bue's.
But this level of arrogance inevitably leads to a fatal slip. During a drunken dinner party with other courtiers, Lao Ai gets into an argument and is overheard loudly bragging that he is the young king's stepfather.
Which is just a spectacular miscalculation.
Bragging about secretly sleeping with the mother of the most ruthless young monarch in China?
Yeah. Word of this outburst inevitably reaches King Zheng. Lao Ai realizes his secret is out. He knows the king's temperament. He knows the punishment will be total annihilation.
So in 238 BC, Lao Ai decides his only chance of survival is a preemptive strike.
while King Zheng is traveling out of the capital to the former royal center of Yang for a coming-of-age ceremony.
Lao Ai steals the Queen Mother's official seals.
He uses them to forge orders, mobilizes the palace guards and a rebel militia, and launches a full-blown coup d'etat.
King Zheng is 22 years old at this exact moment. He doesn't panic. He responds with a level of cold, calculated brutality that really becomes his signature.
He immediately orders his most trusted generals to counterattack.
A bloody battle erupts in the streets of the capital. Hundreds of rebels are slaughtered. Lao Ai manages to flee the city, but the king places a staggering bounty on his head.
1 million copper coins if taken alive, 500,000 if dead.
Lao Ai is swiftly captured, and the punishment King Zheng metes out isn't just about justice. It's a meticulously crafted performance of absolute terror.
He has Lao Ai subjected to the punishment of being torn apart by chariots.
Which means the condemned man's head and 4 limbs are tied to 5 separate horse-drawn carriages.
Which are then whipped to drive in opposite directions, physically dismembering him in front of the public.
The visceral horror of that execution sends an undeniable message to the entire empire. Don't mess with the king. But he doesn't stop with Lao Ai.
He executes Lao Ai's entire extended family to the 3rd degree of relations: parents, siblings, children.
He hunts down the 2 secret half-brothers, his own mother's young children, and has them beaten to death in sacks.
He purges the court of anyone associated with Lao Ai's faction, and he places his own mother under permanent localized house arrest, stripping her of all power.
This bloodbath is the crucial turning point of his life. It is the moment Yang Zheng stops being a managed asset and takes absolute control of the state.
And then he turns his gaze toward Lu Buwei.
Right, because the king realizes that his former regent was the architect of this entire catastrophe by smuggling Lao Ai into the palace in the first place.
Lu Buwei is stripped of his titles. He's banished to the remote borderlands. And a few years later, anticipating execution, Lu Buwei is forced to commit suicide by drinking poisoned wine.
So by the time he's 24, King Zheng has survived a massive armed rebellion, executed his mother's lover, murdered his own half-brothers, imprisoned his mother, and forced the man who was essentially his father figure to kill himself.
If you consider the psychological impact of that,
it's massive. He learns early on that trust is a fatal vulnerability. The people closest to him were the ones who betrayed him most deeply.
It solidifies a worldview where safety can only be achieved through absolute control, relentless surveillance, and ruthless preemption.
And he would need every ounce of that paranoia. Because as he begins his military campaigns to conquer the other 6 states, the assassination attempts escalate. They go from internal palace coups to professional state-sponsored hits.
Let's fast forward to 227 BC.
Okay.
King Zheng's military machine is rolling across the continent. The state of Yan is next on his target list, and their leadership is in a state of sheer panic.
Crown Prince Dan of Yan decides conventional warfare is useless against the Qin armies. His only play is to cut off the head of the snake.
So he hires a notorious assassin named Jing Kai.
But getting an armed assassin into the throne room of a hyper-paranoid king requires incredible bait.
The bait they use really demonstrates the extreme fanatical measures people were willing to take to stop the Qin advance. Jing Kai needs a gift so valuable that King Zheng will personally grant him an audience.
Right, so he approaches a man named Fan Yuki, a former top-tier Qin general who had defected to Yan.
And King Zheng despised Fan Yuki so intensely that he had placed a bounty of 1,000 pounds of gold on his head.
Jing Kai essentially goes to this general and explains that to save the state of Yan, he needs to present the king with Fan Yuki's severed head.
And Fan Yuki, whose own family had already been executed by King Zheng, agrees.
He commits suicide right then and there so Jing Kai can take his head.
It's a chilling testament to the hatred the king inspired.
Truly. Jing Kai places the severed head in a sealed wooden box. He also brings a highly detailed map of Dukang. This is a fertile region of Yan that they are pretending to surrender.
But rolled tightly inside this map is a dagger, coated in a lethal, fast-acting poison.
Jing Kai is accompanied by a 13-year-old assistant named Qin Shi Huang, a boy who had supposedly committed his first murder at age 12 and was known as a hardened killer.
They travel to the Qin capital, Shenyang. They are granted access to the magnificent throne room, but as they ascend the steps toward the king, the psychological pressure breaks the young assistant.
Qin Shi Huang begins to tremble violently. visibly paralyzed by fear at the sight of the terrifying king of Qin and the sheer scale of the armed guards surrounding the perimeter.
You can imagine the tension in that room suddenly spiking. The Qin courtiers immediately sense something is wrong.
But Jin Kai has nerves of steel. He smoothly covers for his partner, he forces a laugh, and tells the king that the boy is just a rural provincial who has never been in the presence of the majestic Son of Heaven.
And it works, just well enough to keep the audience going.
The guards force the boy to stay back. But Jin Kai is permitted to approach the king's dais alone to present the map.
This moment is described in the texts with cinematic precision.
It really is. Jin Kai slowly unrolls the map on the king's table. As the very end of the scroll unfurls, the poisoned dagger is revealed.
In a fraction of a second, Jin Kai grabs the dagger with his right hand and violently grabs the king's silk sleeve with his left.
And King Zheng survives solely on adrenaline and raw reflex. He jerks backward with such force that his royal silk sleeve tears completely off, allowing him to break Jin Kai's grip.
He leaps from the throne and attempts to draw his sword.
But there is a massive logistical problem here. King Zheng is wearing heavily layered ceremonial robes, and his sword is a traditional ceremonial longsword. It's incredibly long and hangs vertically from his belt.
Right. As the king scrambles backward, dodging the poisoned blade, he is frantically pulling at the hilt. But the sword is too long to draw from the scabbard while moving defensively.
And strict Qin law dictated that absolutely no courtier or official was allowed to carry a weapon in the upper throne room.
The heavily armed palace guards were stationed outside the massive hall doors. They could not cross the threshold with a direct, explicit order from the king.
Which he is way too busy fighting for his life to give.
Exactly. So you have the most powerful, heavily guarded monarch on the planet running in desperate circles around a massive wooden pillar.
Completely unarmed, being chased by a professional assassin wielding a toxic blade.
The court officials are panicking, screaming, but totally helpless.
Then, a minor official steps up. The royal physician, Shi Huang. He's carrying his heavy wooden medical chest, and he just hurls it directly at Jin Kai.
It is a desperate improvisational move, but it alters history.
The heavy medical chest strikes Jin Kai. It breaks his momentum just enough for the king to gain some distance.
Amidst the chaos, courtiers are screaming instructions to the king. They are telling him to push the scabbard behind his back so he can draw the longsword over his shoulder.
He manages to execute the maneuver. He draws the massive blade, turns, and strikes Jin Kai, slicing deeply into the assassin's thigh.
Jin Kai collapses, crippled.
In a final, desperate gambit, he hurls the poisoned dagger at the king, but it misses. It embeds itself deep into the wooden pillar.
The king, unleashing years of pent-up rage and terror, moves in and stabs the incapacitated assassin 8 more times.
The historical records make a very specific point of describing Jin Kai's final moments.
Knowing his mission has failed and his death is imminent, Jin Kai sits back on the floor with his legs splayed wide apart.
Which, in ancient Chinese culture, was considered a highly insulting, deeply offensive posture.
He uses his last breaths to curse and taunt the king, mocking him until the guards finally rush in and hack him to pieces.
After the adrenaline fades, the king is entirely catatonic. The records say he sat back on his throne, gripping his bloody sword, staring blankly for a long time.
It's a profound trauma.
And what's staggering is that this was just the most famous attempt. The psychological battering didn't stop.
There was a deep, lingering paranoia because the attempts continued. Another famous incident involved Gao Jianli, a close friend of Jin Kai.
Right. Gao was a master of the zhu, a traditional stringed instrument. Seeking revenge, he disguised himself and eventually gained a reputation for his musical genius, drawing the attention of the king.
King Zheng discovers Gao's true identity, but his obsession with Gao's music actually overrides his usual protocol of immediate execution.
Instead, the king has Gao's eyes put out, blinding him, believing this neutralizes the threat and keeps him in the court as a personal musician.
But Gao plays a horrific long game. He slowly gains the king's trust over months, being allowed to sit closer and closer to the throne.
Unbeknownst to the king, Gao has hollowed out the heavy wooden body of his instrument and filled it with a massive block of solid lead.
One day, guided purely by the sound of the king's voice, Gao swings the lead-filled instrument at the king's head.
He narrowly misses and is immediately put to death.
And even years later, when the king had become emperor and was conducting a grand imperial tour, a man named Zhang Liang sought revenge for the annihilation of his home state of Han.
Zhang Liang hired a massively muscular strongman, They ambushed the emperor's convoy in a narrow mountain pass.
The strongman hurled a custom-forged metal cone weighing 120 jin, that's roughly 160 pounds, directly at the royal carriage.
A 160-pound metal projectile. It absolutely pulverized the carriage into splinters.
But King Zheng survived because his paranoia had evolved. He never traveled in the main carriage anymore.
He utilized a system of decoy carriages. The assassin obliterated the decoy, and the king, hidden in a secondary carriage, survived while the assassins vanished into the woods.
When you evaluate the extreme hypervigilance, the draconian legal codes, and the obsessive need for physical security that characterizes the Qin Empire,
you really have to filter it through this context. This is a ruler who survived his mother's coup, his regent's machinations, poisonings, blind musicians wielding lead clubs, and 160-pound flying metal cones.
he genuinely believed that there was an assassin lurking in every shadow.
That brings us to a massive pivot. A deeply traumatized, hyper-paranoid genius is now in absolute command of the most formidable military machine of the ancient world.
Let's examine how he utilized that machine to forge the empire.
The military conquest was remarkably swift and terrifyingly systematic. Over a singular decade, from 230 to 221 BC, King Zheng's armies methodically annihilated the remaining 6 warring states.
Commanded by brilliant strategic minds like General Wang Jin.
It is a geopolitical blitzkrieg. He takes down Han, then Zhao, then Yan, Wei, Chu, and finally Qi. By 221 BC, the centuries of constant grinding, bloody warfare that defined the era are over.
King Zheng stands as the undisputed ruler of everything under heaven.
But being called a king is no longer sufficient for him. The rulers of the states he just crushed had called themselves kings. He needed to invent a completely new conceptual framework for his authority.
He needed a title that reflected an unprecedented cosmic achievement. He initiates a linguistic and theological shift.
He takes the character Huang, which was historically associated with the mythical 3 sovereigns, these ancient, almost godlike creator figures.
Then he takes the character Dai, associated with the legendary 5 emperors of Chinese prehistory, including the revered Yellow Emperor.
He fuses them together to create Huangdi, emperor.
He becomes Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin. He is explicitly appropriating the prestige of mythical demigods. It is a religious assertion of absolute supremacy.
He decreed that his dynasty would not just last a few generations, but that his successors would be the 2nd emperor, the 3rd emperor, stretching down to the 10,000th generation.
But conquering a vast, diverse continent with a standing army is entirely different from ruling it.
Completely different. The 6 conquered states had spent centuries developing their own distinct cultures, their own currencies, localized writing systems, and their own units of measurement.
To forge a singular empire, he and his brilliant, ruthless chancellor Li Sai realized they had to standardize reality itself.
They abolished the old feudal system entirely. No more lords inheriting fiefdoms and raising private armies.
They carved the empire into 36 military commanderies, ruled by officials who are appointed by the central government based on merit and loyalty.
And who could be fired or executed at a moment's notice. But the true genius and the true terror of their administration was the obsessive standardization of daily life.
Consider the logistical nightmare of taxation and trade across 7 distinct cultures. They standardized weights and measures. A pound of grain or a length of silk had to be exactly the same in the frozen north as it was in the humid south.
They introduced a single universal currency, the Banliang coin. This was a round copper coin with a square hole in the center, a design so effective it would remain the template for Chinese currency for the next 2 millennia.
They standardized the written language. Chancellor Li Si mandated the exclusive use of the Qin small seal script across the entire continent.
If you think about the impact of this, it's staggering. People in different regions might speak mutually unintelligible dialects. But because the written characters were now standardized, they could all read the exact same imperial decrees, laws, and tax codes.
It created a universal bureaucratic language that remains a foundational pillar of Chinese unity today.
But perhaps the most illustrative detail of this obsessive need for uniformity was the standardization of chariot axles.
Yes, why mandate the exact width of a cart's wheels?
Because over centuries, heavy carts wearing down unpaved dirt roads created deep, hardened ruts. If a merchant took a cart from the former state of Zhao into the state of Wei, the axle width would differ. The wheels wouldn't align with the local ruts, and the cart would shatter.
By forcing a standardized axle width, Qin Shi Huang ensured that his newly constructed, massive national road network could be traversed seamlessly by his military supply chains.
He literally standardized the roads to ensure his armies could deploy instantly, anywhere in the empire. And to guarantee these newly conquered states couldn't rebel, he ordered the complete disarmament of the civilian population.
He confiscated all bronze weapons from the defeated armies.
But he didn't just lock these weapons in an armory. The logistics of this are fascinating. He had thousands of bronze swords, spears, and halberds transported to the capital, melted down, and recast into 12 colossal statues known as the 12 metal colossi.
Historical texts state each of these statues weighed 1,000 dan, that's roughly 70 tons, and stood over 35 feet tall, positioned outside his palace in Zhenyang.
It is the ultimate psychological power move. He takes the very instruments of his enemies' resistance, melts them down, and turns them into 70-ton long ornaments for his palace.
It is an overwhelming visible display of the state's total monopoly on violence.
And this entire system of control was underpinned by a deeply cynical philosophy known as legalism. Walk me through the fundamental difference between legalism and the Confucianism that preceded it.
Confucianism, which was highly influential prior to the Qin, was fundamentally optimistic about human nature. It emphasized moral virtue, familial piety, and rule by ethical example.
A good ruler is like a good father, and the people will naturally follow his righteous example.
Legalism, developed by thinkers like Lord Shang and Han Feizi, completely rejected this. Legalists believed human nature is inherently selfish, greedy, and prone to corruption.
So if people are naturally terrible, you can't rely on their moral compass. You have to rely on fear.
Precisely. Legalism posits that the only way to maintain a stable state is through the two handles, reward and punishment. And the punishments must be incredibly strict, codified into publicly known laws, and enforced with draconian, unyielding brutality.
And we are talking about extreme brutality. Let's look at the famous 5 pains punishment that was codified under Li Si.
This wasn't just execution. It was a sequence of horrific mutilations designed to inflict maximum physical and psychological agony.
First, they brand the criminal's forehead with a tattoo marking them as a convict. Second, they cut off the nose. Third, they chop off the left or right foot. Fourth, they castrate the individual.
And finally, the 5th pain, they execute them, often by cutting them in half at the waist.
It was designed to completely destroy the individual's physical form before death.
And crucial to legalist doctrine was the concept of collective responsibility. If one person commits treason or a severe crime, it wasn't just the perpetrator who faced the 5 pains.
The state would execute the offender's entire extended family up to 3 generations: parents, siblings, and children.
The psychological calculus is terrifyingly effective. Even if you are willing to risk your own life to rebel against the emperor, are you willing to watch your children, your spouse, and your parents be mutilated and cut in half because of your actions?
The system weaponized familial love to enforce state obedience.
This relentless authoritarian control brings us to the event that firmly cemented Qin Shi Huang's reputation in traditional historiography, not just as a conqueror, but as an anti-intellectual tyrant.
This is the legendary Purge of 213 to 212 BC, widely known as the burning of books and burying of scholars.
This is one of the most culturally traumatic events recorded in ancient texts.
The narrative states that Chancellor Li Si grew increasingly frustrated with scholars who were studying the ancient classics of poetry and history. He argued that these scholars were using historical records of past, supposedly more virtuous rulers, to critique the harsh realities of the Qin regime.
They were using the past to criticize the present.
Li Si proposes a radical, systemic erasure of historical memory. He orders the burning of the classic of poetry, the Book of Documents, and all the historical chronicles of any state other than Qin.
The decree was absolute. Anyone caught discussing these banned texts would be publicly executed in the marketplace. Anyone caught hiding the books after 30 days would be branded with tattoos and sent to a lifetime of hard labor building the Great Wall.
The only books permitted were highly practical manuals on agriculture, medicine, forestry, and divination.
And the following year, the story gets much darker. Sima Qian writes that the emperor, furious that scholars in the capital were secretly gossiping about his paranoia and his obsession with magic, ordered a sweeping interrogation.
As a result, 460 scholars were allegedly buried alive in a mass grave as a horrifying warning to the rest of the intellectual elite.
Burying 460 philosophers alive is a chilling image. It's the primary reason Confucian scholars have vilified him for 2,000 years.
But we really need to engage in some rigorous source criticism here, because modern historians are re-evaluating this narrative and finding significant inconsistencies.
Scholars like Michael Nyland, Martin Kern, and Li Kaiwan argue that the burning and burying is likely a highly exaggerated narrative constructed by later dynasties.
First, regarding the book burning. The texts weren't completely eradicated from the face of the earth. The decree ordered private citizens to surrender their copies, but 2 pristine copies of every single banned text were kept safely in the imperial archives for the official court scholars to consult.
That fundamentally shifts the perspective. The state kept the books for itself. It wasn't about destroying the knowledge, it was about monopolizing it.
The emperor wanted to be the sole gatekeeper of history, and the ultimate historical irony is that those imperial archives, containing the only remaining copies of these classics, were eventually burned to the ground by rebel armies when the dynasty collapsed.
The rebels, not the emperor, caused the permanent loss of those texts.
Furthermore, researchers like Martin Kern point out that early Han Dynasty authors frequently cite these exact banned classics in their writings. That simply wouldn't be possible if Li Si had successfully wiped them out.
Now, regarding the burying of the 460 scholars, there is intense philological skepticism. The historian Sima Qian uses the Chinese character Kang.
Over time, king came to mean buried alive, but in older Warring States texts, it simply meant to trap and kill. It was often used to describe the mass slaughter of captured enemy soldiers, not literally burying them under dirt while breathing.
And who exactly were these 460 people? Were they noble, peaceful Confucian philosophers debating ethics in a courtyard?
The historical context suggests otherwise. At this point in his life, the emperor was deeply entangled with fangxi, esoteric alchemists, magicians, and charlatans who promised they could synthesize an elixir of immortality.
Many of these alchemists were blatant swindlers who drained massive amounts of imperial wealth and failed to deliver. When the emperor realized he was being conned, he was enraged.
It is highly probable that the people rounded up and executed were a network of these fraudulent alchemists who were spreading seditious rumors to cover their own failures.
So the first emperor executes a group of scam artist alchemists who stole from him. Over a century later, Sima Qian, who works for the Han Dynasty, takes this execution, tweaks the character king, and spins it into a tale of righteous Confucian philosophers being buried alive.
He retroactively turns grifters into martyrs to paint the previous regime as cartoonish villains. It is a masterful piece of historical propaganda.
It perfectly encapsulates how history is written by the victors. The Han Dynasty needed to legitimize their own rule by portraying the Qin as an unnatural, tyrannical aberration.
While Qin Shi Huang was undeniably ruthless, the specific legends of his anti-intellectual vandalism appear to be heavily massaged by later generations with clear political agendas.
While we are unraveling these historical mysteries, there is a massive, glaring omission in the historical record of Qin Shi Huang's life.
He ruled the largest empire on earth. He had palaces filled with thousands of concubines. He fathered over 50 recorded children. But in all the surviving chronicles, there is absolutely zero mention of an empress. No official wife is ever named. Why?
It is a profound anomaly in Chinese history. Tradition and statecraft dictate that a ruler must elevate one woman to the status of empress and name a crown prince early on to ensure a stable line of succession.
Qin Shi Huang refused to name an empress, and he stubbornly delayed naming a crown prince until he was literally on his deathbed. We can trace this phobia directly back to the trauma of his early reign.
You're talking about his mother and the Laowai conspiracy.
Exactly. His mother used her position as queen dowager to elevate a fake eunuch, build a rival power base, and attempt to overthrow him.
That betrayal instilled a deep, permanent fear of maternal influence in politics. Throughout Chinese history, powerful consorts and their extended families often wielded immense factional power, sometimes usurping thrones.
By intentionally never elevating a woman to the status of empress, Qin Shi Huang ensured that no consort's family could ever gain the political leverage necessary to challenge his absolute, centralized authority.
But recent archaeological excavations around the emperor's massive tomb complex have unearthed some incredibly grim details about the women who did occupy his inner palace.
Archaeologists have discovered the dismembered remains of numerous young women buried in the entryways of the mausoleum.
The findings paint a dark picture of life and death in the imperial harem. Historical texts document that upon his death, his successor decreed that all the late emperor's concubines who had not borne him children should not be allowed to leave the palace.
Instead, they were ordered to follow him into the afterlife. The scattered, disarticulated nature of the remains suggests a violent mass human sacrifice.
And it gets even more fascinating from a demographic standpoint. Recent DNA analysis conducted on the reconstructed facial structures of some of these remains indicates that some of these women possessed distinct Western, Eurasian, or Persian genetic markers.
This implies that the emperor's harem was vast and highly international, drawing women from far beyond the traditional borders of the Central Plains. Yet, despite their diverse origins, they were ultimately treated as grave goods, sacrificed to serve him in the spirit world.
Which transitions us perfectly into his ultimate obsession. As his earthly empire stabilized, his ambitions shifted entirely toward conquering death itself.
His mega-projects and his quest for immortality consumed the latter half of his reign and drained the empire of his lifeblood. Let's talk about the sheer scale of his architectural obsessions, because the human cost is almost unfathomable.
First, there is the precursor to the Great Wall. Now, the stone and brick wall you picture today is mostly from the much later Ming Dynasty.
But Qin Shi Huang originated the concept of a unified northern barrier. He ordered his top commander, General Meng Tian, to mobilize a massive labor force to connect the disparate existing walls of the conquered northern states into a single, continuous fortification against the nomadic Xiongnu tribes.
The logistics of this project were an absolute nightmare. Hundreds of thousands of peasant conscripts and convicted criminals were marched to the brutal northern frontiers.
The engineering principle was build with what is available and keep moving forward. In the plains, they use a technique of violently ramming earth and gravel between wooden frames until it was as hard as stone.
In the mountains, they quarried local rock. The death toll from malnutrition, exposure to freezing winters, and sheer exhaustion was astronomical.
It gave rise to the enduring cultural trauma that the wall is the longest cemetery in the world, built on the bones of its laborers.
He also engineered the Lingqua Canal, which is a masterpiece of ancient hydrology.
Walk me through the logistics of that, because connecting river systems sounds incredibly difficult.
It was a vital military project. The emperor wanted to conquer the Bayou tribes in the far south, but transporting grain overland through mountainous jungles was impossible.
So he ordered engineers to link the Xiang River, which flows north into the Yangtze River system, with the Li River, which flows south into the Pearl River Basin.
The engineers actually built a sophisticated system of spillways and arguably the world's oldest transport locks.
By connecting these two massive, opposing river systems, he created a continuous inland waterway that allowed his supply boats to travel uninterrupted from the northern plains straight into the deep south.
It was an engineering triumph that facilitated a massive military expansion.
And while he's reshaping the geography of the continent, he's building palaces at an absurd rate. The records say he built over 200 palaces in the capital region alone.
The crown jewel was the Apang Palace. The foundational terrace of the front hall was reportedly 75,000 square meters. It was designed to seat 10,000 people. It was a monument to megalomania.
Yet, amidst all this monumental construction for the living world, the emperor was utterly terrified of leaving it. As he aged, his fear of mortality morphed into a clinical obsession.
He became the ultimate patron of any alchemist, magician, or charlatan who claimed to possess the secret to eternal life. He funded massive expeditions, personally traveling to the eastern seaboard multiple times, staring out at the ocean, desperately seeking contact with immortal beings.
This leads to the legendary story of Zhu Fu. The emperor summons this court sorcerer Xu Fu and gives him a blank check.
He provides him with a massive fleet of ships, vast stores of grain, and 3,000 young men and women.
Their sole mission is to sail into the Eastern Sea, locate the mythical Mount Penglai, and retrieve an immortal magician who holds the elixir of life.
Yu Fu takes this massive armada, sails off into the horizon, and never returns.
It is highly probable that Xu Fu recognized the reality of his situation. He knew he was never going to find an immortal magician. He also knew that returning empty-handed to a hyper-paranoid emperor who regularly cut people in half for minor failures meant certain execution.
So, he simply chose to keep sailing. Enduring legends suggest his fleet eventually landed on the islands of Japan, colonizing it and integrating with the local populations to escape the emperor's wrath.
It was the smartest move Xu Fu could have made. Meanwhile, back in Xianyang, the emperor's paranoia is reaching an apocalyptic fever pitch.
He fundamentally believed that evil spirits and invisible assassins were tracking his movements. To combat this, he constructed an elaborate network of walled, elevated walkways and subterranean tunnels connecting his hundreds of palaces.
He mandated that his movements be kept a total state secret. He would travel between palaces entirely unseen. If anyone revealed which palace he was sleeping in on a given night, they were immediately put to death.
He essentially built a prison of his own design, trapping himself in a labyrinth of luxury because he was too terrified to walk in the open air.
But deep down, he knew the alchemists were failing. He knew he couldn't outrun death indefinitely. And so he prepared for his afterlife with the same obsessive, militaristic precision he utilized in life.
He began construction on his grand mausoleum when he was just 13 years old, eventually conscripting upwards of 700,000 laborers to build an underground replica of his empire.
And this brings us to one of the most breathtaking archaeological discoveries in human history, the Terracotta Army.
Unearthed by farmers digging a well in 1974.
The statistics of this discovery are staggering. We are looking at 6,000 life-sized, custom-molded clay soldiers in the main pits alone. These aren't just copy-pasted clones.
The artists used different molds for heads and bodies, and then hand-sculpted individual facial features, hairstyles, and armor details for every single warrior.
And originally, they weren't the earthen brown color we see today. They were painted in vibrant, lifelike colors. They used an incredibly rare, synthetically produced chemical pigment known today as Han purple.
A complex barium copper silicate that requires advanced chemical knowledge and extreme heat to produce. The level of industrial organization required is astounding.
They weren't just holding clay weapons either. Archaeologists have excavated over 40,000 actual, functional, lethal bronze weapons buried alongside the clay soldiers. Swords, intricately designed crossbow triggers, and bundles of arrows.
They were armed for a real war in the spirit world. The British historian John Mann analyzed the logistics and calculated that to produce just the foundations and the statues, a dedicated workforce of 16,000 highly skilled artisans and laborers working nonstop could have completed it in 2 years.
It was a massive industrial-scale assembly line dedicated entirely to death.
And we must remember, the Terracotta Army is just the perimeter guard. They are located a mile away from the actual tomb.
The emperor's central resting place is a massive earthen pyramid at the foot of Mount Lai, which remains completely unexcavated to this day. We only have the ancient texts to tell us what lies beneath.
Sima Qian describes a vast subterranean palace filled with rare treasures, replicas of scenic towers, the ceiling adorned with pearls to represent the cosmos, and the floor mapped with the great rivers of China, the Yangtze and the Yellow River.
But those rivers weren't filled with water. Sima Qian writes that they were filled with liquid mercury, circulated mechanically to simulate flowing water.
For a long time, modern historians dismissed this as poetic exaggeration.
Until modern science intervened. Archaeologists have conducted extensive soil sampling and inserted scientific probes deep into the unexcavated pyramid mound.
They discovered abnormally massive concentrations of mercury in the soil, some readings showing 100 times the naturally occurring rate.
The distribution of the mercury even vaguely matches the map of China's water systems. The terrifying legend appears to be completely true. There is a toxic sea of liquid metal sealed beneath the earth.
Which is the ultimate tragic irony of his life, because the very substance he used to build his rivers of immortality in the afterlife is likely the exact substance that killed him in the real world.
Yes. In 210 BC, during his 5th grand imperial tour of eastern China, the first emperor fell gravely ill. He was only 49 years old.
While we cannot perform an autopsy, the prevailing historical and medical consensus is that he succumbed to severe cumulative mercury poisoning.
The esoteric elixirs of immortality his court alchemists have been feeding him for years were heavily laced with mercury and other toxic heavy metals.
The medicine he took to live forever slowly destroyed his nervous system and organs.
He is traveling on the road. He is at a complex called the Shaki Palace, which is a massive 2 months of travel away from the heavily fortified capital of Xianyang. And suddenly he dies.
The man who held the entire continent together through sheer psychological terror is just a corpse.
This creates an immediate catastrophic crisis for the 2 most powerful men in his entourage, Chancellor Li Si and the chief eunuch Zhao Gao.
Li Si and Zhao Gao analyze the geopolitical reality and panic. The empire is vast, only recently conquered, and seething with underlying resentment.
It is held together by the gravity of the emperor's terrifying living presence. If the news of his death leaks while they are hundreds of miles away from the capital's military garrisons, the 6 former states will instantly erupt into open rebellion.
Furthermore, the emperor, in his refusal to face mortality, had never officially codified a will naming his successor.
His most capable son, the eldest Prince Fusu, is stationed far away on the northern frontier with the brilliant General Meng Tian, commanding 300,000 elite troops.
The eunuch Zhao Gao has a bitter, long-standing feud with General Meng Tian. Chancellor Li Si knows that if Fusu takes the throne, Fusu will likely replace him with Meng Tian.
So, out of pure self-preservation, these two men hatch a conspiracy that sounds like it belongs in a pulp thriller. They decide to hide the fact that the most famous man on Earth is dead.
They place the emperor's lifeless body back inside his highly secure, enclosed, shaded carriage. They order the massive royal entourage to proceed as if nothing has happened.
They routinely bring food to the carriage door. They pretend to submit official reports through the window, and Zhao Gao, mimicking the emperor's voice, issues imperial decrees from inside.
But there is a massive biological problem. It is high summer in eastern China. They are dragging a dead body in a wooden box across the countryside in the July heat.
A decomposing body is going to emit an unmistakable stench. The royal guards and the thousands of soldiers in the convoy are going to notice. What is their solution?
It is a grotesque logistical maneuver. They order the convoy to purchase massive carts of rotting, salted fish. They position these fish carts immediately in front of and immediately behind the emperor's carriage.
The overpowering, putrid stench of the salted fish masks the smell of the decomposing ruler of the known world. It is a stunning, humiliating final journey for a man who claimed to be a living god.
While the fish-scented convoy slowly trundles back toward the capital, Li Si and Zhao Gao execute the political phase of their coup.
They forge an official imperial edict using the emperor's stolen seals and send it by fast courier to the northern border.
The forged letter accuses Prince Fusu of being unfilial and incompetent, and it accuses General Meng Tian of disloyalty. The letter explicitly orders both men to commit suicide.
And Prince Fusu, who was heavily influenced by Confucian ideals of filial piety and absolute obedience to one's father, receives this forged letter. Despite the suspicions of his generals, Fusu obeys what he believes is his father's final command.
He draws his sword and takes his own life. General Meng Tian is imprisoned and eventually forced to do the same.
With the capable heir eliminated, the conspirators arrive in the capital, finally announce the emperor's death, and install his naive, pliable 18th son, Hu Hai, as the second emperor.
Hu Hai takes the throne named Qin Shi. He is young, completely inexperienced in statecraft, and entirely under the psychological control of the manipulative eunuch Zhao Gao.
His reign lasts a microscopic 3 years, but the damage he inflicts on the empire is apocalyptic.
To secure his illegitimately gained throne, Hu Hai, guided by Zhao Gao's paranoia, initiates a reign of terror against his own bloodline. He executes all of his siblings.
We're talking about the public execution of over 20 of his own brothers and sisters in displays of horrific cruelty, just to ensure no one can challenge his claim.
He purges the court of the veteran military leaders and seasoned ministers who had actually built his father's empire.
And instead of easing the incredible burden on the peasantry, who are starving and exhausted from decades of building the Great Wall, the canals, and the massive mausoleum, Hu Hai actually intensifies the exploitation.
He increases taxes to the point where peasants are forced to surrender a full 2/3 of their harvest to the state. He conscripts tens of thousands more laborers to continue expanding the Peng Palace.
He essentially bleeds a starving patient.
But the real power behind the throne is Zhao Gao. Zhao Gao systematically isolates the young emperor, convincing him that a true, majestic ruler should remain hidden deep within the inner palace, indulging in earthly pleasures, while Zhao Gao handles the tedious affairs of state.
Eventually, Chancellor Li Si realizes the monster he helped create. Li Si attempts to submit a memorial warning the emperor about Zhao Gao's immense corruption.
But Zhao Gao outmaneuvers him completely. He intercepts the message, accuses Li Si of treason, and has the chancellor imprisoned.
And the irony here is incredibly dark. Zhao Gao has Li Si executed in the marketplace, using the 5 pains punishment, the exact same horrific sequence of branding, amputation, and bisection that Li Si himself had codified into Qin law. Li Si dies by his own brutal invention.
With Li Si dead, Zhao Gao is elevated to chancellor. He is the undisputed master of the court. But he needs to test his absolute control over the remaining ministers.
He needs to know exactly who is a sycophant completely loyal to him, and who might still harbor a shred of independent thought or loyalty to the royal family.
This leads to an event that birthed the famous Chinese idiom Zi Lu Wei Ma, calling a stag a horse.
This scene is a masterclass in Orwellian psychological manipulation. During a formal gathering of the entire court, Zhao Gao leads a live deer right into the center of the throne room. He bows, presents it to Emperor Hu Hai, and says with absolute unblinking seriousness, "Your Majesty, I have brought you a magnificent horse."
Emperor Huai is understandably confused. He laughs, thinking it's a joke, and says, "Chancellor, you must be mistaken. That is clearly a deer, not a horse."
But Zhao Gao does not break character. He turns his gaze to the assembled ministers, the most powerful bureaucrats in the empire, and demands, is this a horse or is this a deer?
If you put yourself in the shoes of a minister in that room, you are looking at an animal with antlers. Objective reality tells you it is a deer.
But standing next to it is the man who just tortured the prime minister to death, demanding that you override your own eyes and call it a horse.
It is the ultimate test of compliance. The ministers are forced to choose between objective reality and physical survival. Some ministers, perhaps too terrified to speak or holding on to a shred of integrity, keep their mouths shut.
Some brave or remarkably foolish ministers tell the truth and state it is a deer. But the crafty, fawning ministers immediately bow and echo Zhao Gao, yes, Chancellor, it is indeed a magnificent horse.
And the aftermath is chilling. Zhao Gao meticulously memorizes the faces of everyone who spoke. Over the following weeks, he systematically fabricates charges of treason against every single minister who called it a deer, and every minister who stayed silent. He has them all executed.
It perfectly illustrates a regime that has descended into total, unrecoverable madness. It is no longer governed by laws or even by a tyrant's strategic logic. It is governed solely by arbitrary terror.
Zhao Gao proved he could bend reality itself, making the entire government complicit in a blatant, absurd lie. But this absolute suffocating control at the top masks a complete structural rot at the foundation of the empire.
The end comes with shocking speed. Rebellions are flaring up in every province. When rebel armies literally break through the mountain passes and approach the gates of the capital, Emperor Huai finally snaps out of his delusion and realizes Zhao Gao has doomed him.
But it's too late. Zhao Gao, fearing the emperor will scapegoat him to appease the rebels, preemptively sends his own son-in-law with an armed detachment into the emperor's private quarters.
Cornered, alone, and betrayed by his only confidant, the 23-year-old second emperor is forced to commit suicide.
How did these massive rebellions actually start? We have to look at the butterfly effect and how the brittle, unyielding nature of legalist philosophy proved to be its fatal flaw. The spark wasn't a noble uprising, it was an administrative glitch.
Let's rewind a couple of years to 209 Meiji, shortly after the first emperor's death. We meet two men, Chen Sheng and Wu Guang. They are low-level military captains.
They are marching a group of 900 conscripted peasants to guard a remote northern border outpost. But en route, they encounter massive, unseasonal rainstorms. The rivers flood, the roads are completely washed out, and their march is halted. They are trapped by the weather.
And here is where the strict, uncompromising laws of the Qin Dynasty seal its own fate. As we discussed earlier, Qin military law was absolute and draconian. Under the legal code, failing to arrive at a military posting by the exact specified deadline carried a mandatory sentence, death by execution.
It didn't matter if the delay was caused by a flood, a landslide, or a meteor striking the road. There was no force majeure clause. There was no judge you could appeal to for clemency. Late equals death.
So Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, look at the weather, look at their 900 shivering, delayed men, and they do the brutal math of legalism.
Chen Sheng articulates the harsh reality of their situation flawlessly. He gathers the terrified peasants and says, in essence, if we continue on and arrive late, we will be executed. If we desert and flee into the mountains, we will eventually be caught and executed. If we rebel against the empire, the penalty is also execution. Since our fate is death, regardless of what we do, why not die trying to create a new nation?
It exposes the ultimate failure of zero-tolerance draconian law. When the punishment for every single infraction is death, you remove any incentive for people to obey the law once they've stepped even a millimeter out of line. You've given them absolutely nothing left to lose.
To convince these 900 untrained peasants to actually draw swords against the formidable, heavily armored Qin military machine, Chen Sheng and Wu Guang engage in some brilliant psychological warfare.
They write the characters Chen is king on a piece of silk. Shove it deep into the belly of a fish and ensure that the soldiers catch and prepare that exact fish for dinner. When the soldiers cut open the fish and find the message, they believe it is a divine mandate from the heavens.
Chen Sheng had an instinct for this kind of grand ambition. Years earlier, when he was just an impoverished day laborer plowing fields, he told his fellow farmhands that he wouldn't forget them when he became wealthy and powerful.
They laughed at him, asking how a farmhand could become a king. Chen Sheng replied with a proverb that is still deeply famous in Chinese culture today. How can a sparrow understand the lofty aspirations of a swan?
His swan song was brief, But it changed the course of world history. Chen Sheng and Wu Guang's mutiny at Zhejiang was the spark that ignited a continent-wide powder keg.
Because everyone else in the empire was living under that same terrifying legal code, their 900 men quickly swelled to a rebel army of over 100,000. Peasants, tired of taxes, former nobles wanting their states back, escaped convicts, everyone who had suffered under the Qin yoke rose up in a simultaneous explosion of violence.
The mighty Qin Empire shatters like a glass window. Chen Sheng's personal rebellion is eventually crushed by Qin generals, and he is assassinated by his own guard just 6 months later.
But he'd broken the dam. Other, more powerful warlords, namely the aristocratic Xiang Yu and the peasant-born Liu Bang, take up the mantle and march massive armies toward the capital.
The final collapse in the capital is a bloodbath of poetic justice. After the eunuch Zhao Gao forces the second emperor to commit suicide, Zhao Gao realizes he cannot take the throne himself. He tries to install a young prince named Ziying as a puppet king.
But Ziying knows exactly the kind of treacherous monster he's dealing with. Ziying feigns a severe illness, refuses to attend his own coronation, and lures Zhao Gao to his private residence. When Zhao Gao arrives, Ziying and his sons ambush him and stab the eunuch to death.
But Ziying's victory is hollow. He only rules a crumbling, starving capital for 46 days. The rebel armies breach the final mountain passes. Realizing the situation is hopeless, Ziying surrenders.
He ties a white silk rope around his own neck in a traditional symbol of submission and hands over the imperial seals to the rebel leader, Liu Bang.
Shortly after, the rival, far more brutal warlord Zhang Yu arrives at the capital. Zhang Yu executes Ziying, slaughters every remaining member of the Qin royal family, and orders his troops to set fire to the magnificent Epang Palace and the imperial archives.
The texts say the fires burned uncontrollably for 3 straight months.
In 206 BC, a mere 15 years after Qin Shi Huang unified the continent and declared his dynasty would last 10,000 generations, the Qin Dynasty was entirely violently wiped off the map.
It was eventually replaced by the Han Dynasty, founded by Liu Bang, which would rule for 4 centuries and deeply shape Chinese cultural identity.
But the secret of the Han Dynasty's success is that they quietly retained the massive administrative structures, the standardized writing, and the centralized bureaucratic power created by the Qin. They just wrapped it in a much more palatable, merciful, and flexible ideology of Confucianism.
We've covered a staggering amount of history. But what does this all signify for our understanding of power? The Qin Dynasty teaches us a profound lesson about the inherent vulnerabilities of extreme centralization.
Zero-tolerance policies and absolute unyielding control can create stunning, almost unimaginable short-term success. Qin Shi Huang standardized a massive, diverse continent in a single decade. He built engineering wonders of the world.
But those exact same brutal methods created an incredibly brittle system. The legalist philosophy relied entirely on pervasive fear and a flawlessly functioning, infallible central authority.
It had no flexibility, no empathy, no shock absorbers. A system that cannot bend to accommodate a simple, uncontrollable rainstorm delaying a march will inevitably shatter when the pressure builds.
It's the difference between a sword made of tempered steel that can flex and absorb a blow and a sword made of cast iron that hits a rock and violently splinters into pieces. The Qin Empire was pure cast iron.
Before we conclude, consider a final thought regarding Qin Shi Huang's obsessive fear of death and his desperate attempts to secure his afterlife. Think back to the sheer scale of the Terracotta Army.
6,000 individualized clay warriors, tens of thousands of real bronze weapons, rivers of toxic mercury, a subterranean palace that required the backbreaking labor of 700,000 people to construct. It is an absolute, unparalleled masterpiece of paranoia, ego, and power.
He built it meticulously, diverting unimaginable resources to protect himself from his spiritual enemies in the afterlife.
He poured the wealth, the physical labor, and the actual lives of an entire generation into an impenetrable underground fortress for the dead.
But consider the terrible, tragic irony of his actions. By bleeding the empire's strength into the dirt to build his tomb, and by ruling the living with such unyielding cruelty to accomplish it, Qin Shi Huang practically guaranteed that his living descendants would be universally despised, swiftly overthrown, and brutally slaughtered.
He spent everything protecting his corpse, and left absolutely no one to protect his children in the real world. Does the civilization's obsession with immortalizing its leaders always come at the cost of its own survival? It is something to seriously consider when looking at monuments of power. Until next time, keep diving deep.